And this is going to be dealt with by Professor Angelika Malinar. She's presently a professor of Indian studies at the University of Zurich, where she's been engaged in the university research priority program named Asia and Europe, among other things she's working on. She's also taught and researched at the University of Tübingen, I think I pronounced that right, in Germany, SOAS, which is part of the University of London, and the Free University of Berlin. She's expert in both Indology and philosophy. Her doctoral dissertation was on Bhagavad Gita, Doctrines and Concepts. It has now become a famous book. She has worked on Indian philosophy, Indian aesthetics, on rasa theory, and social cultural issues. Her other interests include Sanskrit literature, especially the epics and Puranas, modern Hinduism, and Oriya literature, which trade-offs between India and Europe in modernity, and so on. Her list of accomplishments is long and impressive, so I'm going to stop here. So today she'll be speaking on expounding God's singularity in the Mahābhārata epic. So, Angelika, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. Yes, good evening, and I'm very happy to be part of this event, and thanks the organizer for inviting me. Is this sound okay? Because here in Zurich there is some thunderstorm coming down, so I hope it will be all right. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss Indian notions of God in a transdisciplinary context and to explore connections between Indian theistic discourse and Western theological and philosophical debates. Since I'm not only crossing over to the Indian side, but also presenting my analysis from a different disciplinary perspective and also approach, I like to give you some idea of my approach also to the chapter I was invited to write for the book. So there was, and perhaps still is, a certain hesitancy to establish connections between Western theological and philosophical debates and the Indian tradition. And this hesitancy is rooted in the much criticized colonial Orientalist skepticism towards the Indian tradition. The skepticism was justified with claims to what one could call Western exceptionalism and epistemic hegemony. Accordingly, abstract categories and well-cherished tradition of intellectual history of the West, like philosophy, were regarded unique Western achievements, and also the application of terms like theism, not to speak of monotheism, was accompanied with many caveats. Such hegemonic claims have been now historically deconstructed and criticized from different perspectives by scholars in disciplines engaging historically with Indian sources, so scholars like me, but also religious studies scholars, and also by scholars engaging with post-colonial perspectives. While some of the post-colonial studies scholars outrightly reject the application of terms like theology, monotheism, and so on as disturbing and distorting the Indian tradition and its exceptional forms of thoughts, some Indologist and religious studies scholar continue to engage from historical and systematic perspectives with Indian source texts, also in consideration of interdisciplinary concerns. My research is part of this historical reconstruction with a view to interdisciplinary engagements, but it also includes the study and the critical reflection of these colonial Orientalist taxonomies. This entails dealing with cases in which transdisciplinary conversations were circumvented by employing these Orientalist taxonomies. And this has been indeed the case with the classification of Vaishnava teachings in the Mahābhārata epic. As I pointed out in earlier studies of two of the prominent epic texts, the Bhagavad Gita and the Narayaniya, the history of research is marked by a categorical uneasiness regarding their doctrines. So I'm very glad that we have this project here and the conference. This uneasiness is obvious in expressions like quasi-theism, as applied to the Bhagavad Gita by Indologist Paul Hacker, or by regularly putting monotheism in apostrophes to indicate that it is not really monotheism in the sense of Christianity, Jewish tradition, or Islam. On the other hand, Western scholars jumped at a term you find in the Narayaniya, the term ekanta, and translated it without much ado as monotheistic doctrine. In an attempt to address this hesitancy and also unclarity, I suggested the term cosmological monotheism for the singularity of God, Vasudeva Krishna, as taught in the Bhagavad Gita. In doing so, I found Jan Assmann's reconstruction of the cosmological monotheism in ancient Egypt useful for interpreting the doctrines of the Bhagavad Gita and connecting them to historical and systematic classifications of theism. Characteristic for the Bhagavad Gita's formulation of monotheism is the acceptance of other gods, of beings considered perfect as belonging to God's world, but not as belonging to his highest transcendent mode of existence. God is proclaimed as being the one and only that is both separate from, but also related to the many, not necessarily to the all. God's relationships to the world, to his world, the temporary embodiments, for instance, are based on a separateness of God as the eternal highest self, as all the epic texts call this ontological category. In my contribution to the Vaiṣṇavism project, I shall elaborate on cosmological monotheism and also probe its usefulness for other promulgation of the divine in the Mahābhārata epic. But I would very much like to discuss this with you also in relation to the idea of panentheism and so on. The Mahābhārata is particularly interesting for exploring Indian god concepts of the classical type because it attests to a feature of the religious history of India that has puzzled and at the same time, as I may say, fascinated scholars, namely the original plurality of monotheistic doctrines. And maybe now I also like to share with you my screen. Is this okay? Right. You can see it? Right, okay. So the Mahābhārata adds to this feature of the plurality. We have many one and highest as they are declared, and particularly significant for the Bhagavad Gita and also other epic texts. And I think this is a big difference also to formulations Jan Assmann has studied in Egypt, is that all these presentations draw heavily on contemporary Indian philosophical discourse. So we have a really philosophically informed promulgation of this new idea of one highest God. In Indian philosophical discourse in the contemporary period, these plural doctrines and also the different ways in which God was interpreted and presented in these texts were debated inter alia. So it's only one of the terms under the heading Ishvara Vada. Vada means theory or philosophical position of God as the originator, but also as the authoritative, as the author of the authoritative knowledge about him. I refer to this Sanskrit classification of philosophical positions because I think if we truly want to cross our boundaries disciplinary-wise, but also across traditions, I think we also need, from a Western perspective, as it is done vice versa, on the side of the scholars dealing with Indian categories, that also these Indian categorizations and the Indian terminology is explored and is part of the debate, also to check the issue, can we really in a way equate things, or are the certain ideas really that different or that similar as it supposed to be if we just use the English classification spectrum. So the plurality of ideas and of communities of followers had a marked impact on the way the singularity of the one, of God, and also later in the Indian tradition of goddess. But of course, this is not part of the Vaishnava tradition, although the case of Lakshmi would be interesting to explore, but this is not now my job. So this plurality has an impact on the way how these gods and the one and only were conceptualized in the epic. The one is not only the one among various other perfected beings like Vedic gods, yogins, accomplished yogins, and so on, but there are also more than one of this one God. These various names given to this one, the Eka, Vasudeva, Krishna, Narayana, Vishnu, and so on, and the attributes ascribed to them mirror the plurality of Hindu religious communities and of Ishvaravada interpretations. Coexistence, competition, and conceptual overlap between them are mirrored in the intertextuality that connects the texts, and have also an impact, at least in my view, that these Vaishnava traditions at least are considered to have family resemblances and are seen as adjacent and interconnected. This plurality of the many ones has sometimes created the impression that we are actually dealing with polytheism, a view supporting interpretations of Hinduism as essentially polytheistic. Indeed, the plurality complicates understanding texts and concepts, and it seems to have caused confusion even among contemporary audiences. At least there are a number of epic texts highlighting states of confusion and wonder that attest to this situation. The complexity can be seen as one of the reasons for also the intense engagement of epic texts with God's name and naming as an essential, though ambiguous feature of the knowledge of God. So I think this nameability, unnameability is an essential point in many of the epic texts addressing these issues, and it will be part of my analysis in the chapter. So God's singularity is connected to the act of naming, yet God is positioned beyond names, being unknowable, ineffable self, and of course all these attributes reject the idea that God would ever be an object of knowledge, which is of course problematic seen from a philosophical perspective. The attributions regarding name are intrinsically connected to the incoherence issues entailed in obtaining knowledge about an all-knowing, all objects knowing entity. This entity defined by eternal self-knowing. I consciously say self-knowing, not self-knowledge, but we can discuss this. Furthermore, the treatment of name and nameability is also influenced by the epic's religious plurality. This can be seen in the list of names adduced in some epic texts and in the identification of names and embodiments of the One that unmistakably are viewed as belonging to this One only. These efforts also extend to an embodiment ascribed to the highest across traditions, the so-called famous all-form, the Vishvarupa. So the appearance of Vasudeva Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita is called all-form, Vishvarupa, but it differs significantly from that of Hari Narayana in the Narayaniya, so you cannot really confuse the one with the other. Therefore, my analysis of the individual epic texts also includes intertextual and contextual aspects. To put this into more concrete terms, I shall deal now briefly with the following two aspects of God's singularity. First, all the epic texts I'm going to deal with position or define God's singularity as a distinct ontological category. And this term of ontological category is in a way something which addresses a bit the discussion we had before about what is an attribute and what not, and what is an essence. Because the ontological category would define something like the essence, but we have several ontological categories, each having an essence. So the specific feature of God as an ontological category is that he is the only member of that ontological category. So there's only one of him. So he is expounded as the only perfect being who is exempt from processes of perfection. All properties defining perfect are assembled in their highest form. And if this assembly actually shapes this essence, or if they are attributes to a substance, the option that this is not a substance, but actually the assembling of these features is something which is, I think, a distinction we need to keep in mind in order to also understand differences and commonalities across the tradition, and maybe also when we are in a conversation with theological or philosophy of religion perspectives. Right, so consequently at this level, God is defined as the so-called Purushottama or Paramatman. The highest Purusha would be the highest conscious entity, and Paramatma the highest self. He is characterized by attributes such as highest knowledge, of course this is not surprising, but also by a strict separation from all kinds of corporeal existence and material agency. The causality issue here, exempt from causality in a worldly sense. This ontological status sets God apart from all other perfected beings, but also from those beings who are also considered to occupy these positions, such as Shiva and Narayana and Vasudeva Krishna and so on. Therefore, the clarification of the singularity of the perfect being in the spectrum of other states of perfection plays an essential role in all these texts. Yeah, it's not just God and the world, but also God and the whole perspective of that this state of perfect is open to other members, and this has to be ruled out. Now, this status as the ontological category is connected to another aspect of singularity, God's relation to the world. God's singularity includes his being regarded as the supreme Lord, as the true ruler and the one and only ruler of the world. And here we have a different term often used. He is called the Avyaya Ishvara, the unchangeable Lord or supreme entity, the mighty Lord. And this puts him in a relationship to the cosmos and the manifoldness of beings. This is something different. The cosmos is one thing, the manifoldness of beings is another, and there are different avenues in which God relates to these two aspects. Of course, this latter point includes, of course, clarifying the issue of God's agency, which must be exempted from typical causal relation, his connection to temporality, and of course to corporality, and there you have similar incongruence issues or congruence issues or paradoxical problems we have discussed before with relation to this perfect being theology and all these implications. So the epic texts deal with these aspects and the issues, logical issues and so on, in comparable but yet quite distinct ways. And just to give you an idea what we are dealing with, so the epic texts of course include the Bhagavad Gita with Vasudeva Krishna, and then the Narayaniya where we have Vishnu Narayana. But also I will refer to various texts in book 5 and 6, which give very interesting other aspects or offer aspects of the whole spectrum which might be interesting and have not often been included in such studies. So I don't know if you want me to at least present you the two different ways the Bhagavad Gita and the Narayaniya goes about this issue of the God as a distinct ontological category. I could do this. I don't know if I started a bit late, but maybe I'm running late already, so I don't want to overstretch your patience, Ellen.
And Angelika, you have plenty of time. You're on
Okay.
20 minutes now. You can do up to 10 minutes more if you want to.
Well, okay. Well, that's very kind. Thank you. So then let me proceed with the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita can be seen as the paradigmatic and most elaborate exposition of the singularity of God, and therefore plays a central role also for the other epic texts. Therefore, my analysis includes it, although, as you know, a separate chapter in the book deals exclusively with it, but I hope we can have a fruitful conversation on the different views or perspectives on the text. In the Bhagavad Gita, the impact of contemporary philosophical discourse, in particular Sankhya philosophy, is considerable, as can be seen in how these issues of singularity are dealt with in the text. God as a single item ontological category is expounded in the Gita by drawing on Sankhya definitions of, and Sankhya, I may also add, is a non-theistic philosophical tradition originally, so it draws on definitions of what Sankhya calls the conscious entity. And as I think you all know, and excuse me for recalling this, Purusha, the conscious entity, is a specific category of being that is painfully involved in corporal existence due to its lack of self-knowledge, but becomes liberated when such knowledge is obtained and continues then to exist in its original ontological separateness, in complete isolation from the world of bodies, from the created world, and other categories of being, also eternal categories of being, like nature, prakriti, or productive matter, as I prefer to translate it. So the Bhagavad Gita accepts this concept and the Sankhya position, but expands it by defining God as an eternally separated Purusha, which means as a conscious being of a specific kind, which was never ever involved in a body. God never needed a body to obtain knowledge of himself. But all the other equally eternal conscious beings need a body to obtain knowledge of themselves. Otherwise, they wouldn't have, or they wouldn't find themselves in a body. The new category entails a hierarchization of these ontological categories, which is formulated, for instance, in the doctrine of the three Purushas in Bhagavad Gita 15. So we have the highest Purusha, which would be then God in this ontological category. Then we have the imperishable Purushas, which are many Purushas, and they are declared to be particles of the highest Purusha in the Gita. And these imperishable Purushas, they are the embodied selves. So they find themselves, as long as they don't know of themselves, they find themselves in perishable bodies. So they exist in the concrete world, in the phenomenal world, as Kshara Purushas. Only the first Purushas are in this world. Yeah, this is explicitly said. Whereas Purushottama is defined as the unchanging sovereign who enters the world and possesses it. This hierarchization defines all members of the category conscious entity as being both separate from the highest. They are separate because they are involved in the bodies, but also they belong to him as particles. This means the most interesting thing is, of course, how are these Akshara Purushas, the plural, connected to this highest Purusha? They are limited because they possess only one body at a time and particularized knowledge. But on the other hand, they have the potential to obtain full knowledge of the perfect, which makes them perfected. But how to conceptualize this becoming perfected is quite open, is left open in the Bhagavad Gita, which is also one of the reasons why it has been such a paradigmatic text. This model allows to interpret otherwise acknowledged perfect beings, such as gods of other religions, but also new perfect beings, such as yogins or God Shiva, as belonging to the category 2 of imperishable Purushas, but in an embodied form that is distinct from the highest one. So while this model implies changing the atheistic design of Sankhya philosophy, the problem of explaining the highest separated Purusha's involvement in the world remains, or is then arises. This can be seen when turning to the treatment of the second aspect of singularity, the relationship with the cosmos. So God's status as here, I rather go on. As the ruler, as the one who possesses or owns, is the owner of the world, but not connected in any agency to the world, causal agency. In explaining the relationship of God to the world, the Bhagavad Gita draws on concepts of yoga, and this can be seen in Bhagavad Gita 9 when God's yogic power, his yoga Aishvara, is made the explanation why he controls nature but still remains detached from nature and therefore also is not part of the world. I wanted to actually, wait a minute. Yeah. So Bhagavad Gita 9 runs, in my unmanifest form, I have spread out this whole world in me exist all beings, but I do not exist in them. Yet again, the creatures do not exist in me. Behold my yoga as the Supreme Lord, while sustaining them, the creatures, and giving them being, myself does not exist in them. Right, so much for the Gita, and maybe I'd briefly present the Narayaniya thing, which is quite different. Is it okay, or you want me to stop? Okay.
Yeah, sure, go for it.
Okay, thank you. The Narayaniya also addresses the two aspects of singularity and deals with them quite differently from the Gita. Let me briefly indicate this. To establish the ontological singularity of Narayana, also this text, the Narayaniya, draws on Sankhya philosophy, but it positions the categories and the line of demarcation between the highest and its particular manifestations in a quite different way. First of all, Narayana is not simply superimposed on the Sankhya category of Purusha as the highest, but he is actually made the first principle of the creation as a whole. So I think this is a concept which may sound familiar to Western concepts. So Narayana is actually declared to be the creator of Prakriti, which is a significant departure from both Sankhya and the Bhagavad Gita. Let me give you just one quote. As he, Narayana, is the inner self of beings, he is also called knower of the field, and he is considered as that Purusha who is free from the three qualities or powers of productive matter of nature. From him, the unmanifest, the Prakriti, is produced, that is characterized by the three gunas. Furthermore, Sankhya categories pertaining to the embodied Purusha are turned into four distinct manifestations of Narayana Purushottama. In this way, God's presence as four forms, and these four forms equate these ontological categories of Sankhya, are stabilized as cosmological stages that shape the world, or each world that is created by Narayana has these categories as part of its inventory. And of course, these four forms of God also serve to map out the path to God. By implication, Narayana transcends these four forms, but this transcendence is not that of a kind of complete separation as we have it in the Bhagavad Gita. Instead, there is a marked border, a single border, an eka anta, which can be crossed so that perfect being is obtained. So let's have a look at this model of the four forms, and one evolves from the other. And of course, I can't go into this issue of why is Vasudeva here. Here you see one concrete example of the intertextuality and the plurality we are dealing with here of the emerging Vaishnava traditions. So each of these deities are actually, of forms of Vasudeva, are at the same time ontological categories, so stable parts of God's world. All right, this model and positioning God as the creator of the world, actually, of Prakriti, removes certain issues of coherence. And so we have a less complex and less paradoxical treatment of God's involvement in the world. And so we have then God is involved in the world as the ordainer and actually the promulgator of his own dharma, of the world order, and also of the teaching of the knowledge about him. Furthermore, this involvement is also established by the so-called House of Dharma, and this is where I end, where you have the interesting feature that, of course, this mirrors, the four forms are mirrored with the house of Dharma, which means concrete presences of Narayana as the highest in the world created by him to protect Narayana's order and, of course, also to protect the knowledge about God. And of course, the interesting thing is that you have here a double identity between Narayana on earth and Narayana in the highest ontological position. And the text actually deals with this Narayana on earth worships the other Narayana, who at the same time promulgates or reveals himself to a potential devotee. And so this is a very interesting feature of the text, making or carving out this very paradox of this co-presence of God, embodied and disembodied at the same time. Right. So thank you for allowing me to take, I think, quite some time. At least I hope I have given you some idea of my approach to the text and introduced the commonalities and differences of the two most elaborate presentation of God's singularity in the epic. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to your suggestions and comments.
Thank you very much, Angelika. It's very interesting. I think it's like food for thought, not just for those of us who actually work with these traditions, but also I think there's something going on for anyone who studies philosophy or religion or even looks at theology itself and this kind of what's going on within the Indian landscape, specifically within the Mahābhārata and the epics. So thank you very much for that presentation. It's very interesting. Let's quickly go over to Ricardo. He has a question. We have a couple of people, so let's start from there. Off you go. As you can unmute yourself, right? Ricardo, I'm not hearing you. Do you want me to unmute too?
Oh, sorry. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk. Very, very, very interesting. So I have two questions. The first one is kind of terminological question, because in the beginning you said that you labeled your approach as cosmological monotheism, if I'm not wrong. So, but later on you mentioned that ontological category, which has just a single element, which is God. So I was wondering, what's the mark of? I mean, why you use this term cosmological? Why not just monotheism? I mean, what was the reason behind the use of this term? That's the first.
Okay, 1 minute. Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
may I one? Okay, it's a very quick one. The second question. In the Narayaniya, you said that it describes God as the creator of Prakriti. I was wondering if this is a creation as nihilo, a creation from nothing.
Okay. To the latter, I would say it's a pleromatic type of creation. So this would be my answer, because Narayana signifies the unity of all these ontological categories in a way that Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita does not. So Krishna is not a pleromatic highest, whereas Narayana is, because these four forms are actually his state of being when these four forms are not present or not start to evolve the world or to start to embody the world. This is why the Narayaniya is also the foundational text of a different religious community, right? They have a different idea of developing than this Pancharatra concept of Vaiṣṇavism. And as to this cosmological monotheism, I try to explain this, why I used this. On the one hand, I just wanted to bring to in the arena of discussion, and also to those who might be interested in other traditions apart from the the three monotheistic religions, that there might be also other ways to conceptualize monotheism. And one of the main points, and we had it already, this objection of Islam towards Christianity, you are not really true monotheism, and so on. A similar discussion goes on with regard to Indian Bhakti traditions of the type we are dealing with. And so when I worked on the Bhagavad Gita for quite some years, it's now, I've this uneasiness, this hesitancy sprang to my face. There were all these kind, of beating about the bush. What is it? And because I had the impression that it was also a kind of keeping the territory of monotheism closed, because otherwise it's anyway too complicated than to put the Indian tradition in, and what is then the monotheism, and monotheism is only this iconoclastic, denying other perfect beings to a certain extent as objects, and so on. I don't need to detail this to you. So working from a historical perspective also, I just wanted to point out, listen, there is also another way. And I found Jan Assmann's analysis of this Egyptian tradition and his term cosmological very matching to what I found in the Bhagavad Gita, although, of course, it's in the Gita heavenly, philosophically loaded. And also, for me, monotheism was trying to correspond or take up this insistence on one. It's this eka, which really, and the highest, and the combination of eka and the highest is the combination of one and single only, but connected to a world, to the cosmos. And this is why I found this term matching. And I don't know, in my field, of course, there is this general question mark, should you at all now start doing the monotheism thing with India, this whole post-colonial criticism, which one needs to take serious. But I think other categories like panentheism and or simply monotheism would be similarly risky of superimposing. So I try to kind of bridge what I found in the Indian text, in the terminology of the Indian tradition, which would not, in a way, be a complete superimposition, which could be at least justified on the basis of the texts. And of course, it was also a kind of, trying to enter a conversation with philosophers of religion, with other theologians, also of course those dealing with other Vaishnava traditions and so on, if this could be an option, right? Maybe for other Vaishnava theologies, another term would be more matching. But so this is the background. This is both levels to the history of research and the debate in my field on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to find a term to summarize what a text emphasizes and highlights.
If you allow me, Alan, that's very good. In fact, it's a very good term. It's a very good term. But I was wondering, perhaps the term has not a lot to do with that, but I was wondering if the multi-form aspect of God is a kind of distinguishing feature. I think it should be, but I'd like to hear from you. I mean, the idea that God, he has these many forms. You mentioned four, but we know that there are much more. So would you say that this is a distinguishing feature of this kind of monotheism?
Not necessarily, because you see, one has to be, as I said, it's marked, there is a marked difference of this so-called Vishvarupa. I think you allude to that, yeah, appearing with 1,000 heads. And am I right? Are you referring to that? Yes, you have it something, I would say, a highest sovereign ruler, the most powerful being on earth must be able to display. But it is not an essential embodiment, yeah? It's not something, it's not God's name. It's not something you call up, it's an epithet. You can recite it as an attribute, but it is quite distinct from the name, for instance, Vasudeva Krishna. It's quite different from Narayana, from Vasudeva, Sankarsana, and so on, these other manifestations, because you actually, those embodiments which are really unmistakably belonging to God as related to the cosmos, they come in a limited number. Yeah, because we are dealing here with a cosmological, ontological inventory, which is established in most of the Vaishnava traditions. Yeah, also in later Vaishnava traditions, I know this a bit because I've researched on the Chaitanya tradition, that you have then all this singling out of these Shaktis and you enumerate this. So this inventory always also means interest to limit the scope of embodiments. And this Vishvarupa form is the demonstration to show you, I'm the one here in charge. But it's not the epitome. And in the Gita, you see, we have 3 forms dealt with in the 11th chapter. And as belonging to Krishna. And in the Narayaniya, we have 2. And apart from these 4 forms I just dealt with. So I think, yes, the capability to display this form is very important. But the tricky thing is also, any perfect being in India can do that. Shiva can do that, the goddess can do that. So there is an issue. Yeah. So, yeah, I would say it's not something which signifies or which in any way in this theological design would in a way threaten God's ontological uniqueness or singularity.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have a question by Christopher over there. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much for that talk. I have a question that's a little more narrow in the sense that my concern is and interest is with the history of Vaishnava religion. And so I guess my question would be, what's your understanding of the relationship between what for convenience we might call the Chaturvyuha, like Vasudeva, Sankarsana, Pradyumna, Aniruddha sequence in the Narayaniya, and on the one hand, the sort of what is sometimes called the Bhagavata cult on the ground, as attested by a handful of physical pieces, and the narrative mythic content of the Mahābhārata, of the story of Krishna. So in other words, could you speak a little bit about what you understand to be the roots by which those 4 names become part of the Narayaniya, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, you see the Mahābhārata, both these Vaishnava texts, the Bhagavad Gita and the Narayaniya, attempt to entwine themselves with the Mahābhārata tradition, as do also other, even Sankhya philosophy and other traditions try to entwine, because it seems to have been the place to disseminate the teaching. And I think the awareness of each other was very strong, and the attempt to, in a way, be part of the transmitted Mahābhārata was something which was more or less successful. And these two traditions around different narratives of Krishna, and there is the huge debate, how many Krishnas are we talking about the Dwaraka Krishna, the Krishna Govinda, and the Krishna of the Harivansha, and so on. And I think we have to have a quite comprehensive idea. We have not to single out these texts, but really see them as part of a intertextuality or conversation they had. And so the Chaturmurti addresses the situation that neighboring communities, other philosophers, theologians have a different position for Vasudeva, and also go about or deal with a narrative of Krishna quite differently. And so the Bhagavad Gita avoids that, all these to the Krishna family, whereas in the Narayaniya it's somehow a very interesting move, not to just have Vasudeva Krishna, but the whole family, the whole Krishna family, because then this whole other narrative of becomes then the Bhagavata tradition becomes also part of a evolving Narayaniya or Narayana theology, which, and this is the other thing, which also is conducive to distinguish this very Narayana, which becomes then the Narayana of the Pancharatrins, to distinguish from the Vedic god Narayana. Yeah, and so historically speaking, we have quite complex differences and commonalities, and really to lend the Narayana theology a distinct identity or intellectual profile. I would prefer that, and of course also on the ground, yeah, because we have these Narayana worshipping grounds, the Stvajas in northern India. And so it is a living tradition, but the intellectual engagement with it was very intense, because you couldn't do that at that time without drawing on this philosophical discourse. So you had to be, in a way, demonstrate and work with it to also get into the epic. Yeah, because the epic itself is full of these kinds of philosophical ideas and disputes. I don't know if this has addressed.
Thank you. Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have Bill. If you can ask a short question, that'll be.
Yeah, I have a question about, I don't know if it's about your project as I understand it, but it's sort of a question that Rebecca raised, and that is this question about whether the perfect God theology can be even found in the Abrahamic texts. And so I'm wondering whether, in part, what you're doing, I may be misunderstanding it, is that you're trying to sort of unearth a kind of theology or ontology or whatever from the text. And so I'm just wondering, imagining what it might be like for someone, were they to only know about the Abrahamic tradition from the Bible, or only about Islam from the Quran, and the kind of difficulties they would face in attempting to derive or to bring about some kind of coherent theology. And I wonder if in both cases, whether they wouldn't come up with something like an understanding that you have that you derive from the Bhagavad Gita, if I make myself clear at all.
Is this to me or to Ellen as representing the project?
No,
yes, I mean, I'm sorry. I
think it's you.
Yes, I apologize. Yes.
No. Yes, as I said, it was for me a kind of trying to open up the conversation, just to see, listen, don't you find this interesting? You were studying the Western tradition and so on, and I was also wondering, is this not also in terms of the historical development, but also in systematic perspectives, something which could also in a way be helpful to understand certain formations and formulations, also interactions between, in particular, also when I think of the medieval philosophy, development of Western philosophy in the medieval period, where all these philosophical elaborated versions of these texts and these ideas came up in interaction with Islam and of course the Christian theology. So I think it might be interesting to bring the Indian situation, which is also historically a little bit earlier than this encounter between Islam and Christianity, with the resuscitation of the Greek philosophical tradition. So yes, I would be interested to know. Yes, could you, in a way, develop such ontological consideration on the basis of these foundational texts of the three monotheistic traditions, the usual ones, so to speak. And would this cosmological not be also an interesting perspective to consider? Yeah, I would be happy to discuss that and to learn about such adoptions, or also criticism, also rejections, of course, with an argument.
Thank you, Angelika. I have one quick question, if I can, just to the end, to kind of wrap this up in a sense for you personally. So from your reading of the text itself, and maybe the text's intertextuality, as you mentioned with other texts and everything else, in your opinion, do you think you can come up with do you think there's problems, or do you think you can come up with an adequately consistent and coherent concept of God out of it?
Yes, I'm quite confident that there are enough commonalities, which nevertheless, which in a way lay a common ground, which then serves as referential, as referential frameworks for the different Vaishnava communities. They, although they of course have maybe different ideas and followings and all that, and different formulations and emphasis, I think this idea of neighboring, that we are neighboring traditions, and also that one shares names, like Vasudeva, a figure like Vasudeva is not something alien, but it's taken into the very heart of the ontological categories ascribed to God. So all these, I think, are points to consider, or this issue of double identity. And yes, I think, one can, of course, in a perfect world with a never-ending limit of words you would write, you could even include the treatment of Shiva, which is also, we find in the Mahābhārata, to include that, because this is also a much debated issue across Vaishnava traditions. What is the ontological statement of Shiva? What does it mean if in the Narayaniya is it said, I'm worshipping myself if I worship Shiva? And of course, the whole issue of gods worshipping gods. It's very interesting kind of constellation. yeah, I do hope, but I also don't mind incoherence issues, as you might have noticed. So, yeah, some common ground, some coherence, but of course with a difference. So yes, Vishishta Advaita, maybe.
Yeah, it's good to try to fish out something from it. So I appreciate you trying to do it. Now, if everyone has a few minutes, if you want to, if there's any questions that can be answered or by any of the three presenters today, or if there's anything that anyone feels that they missed and they wanted to ask it, now's your time. Brief if you want to. I had one from, I think, Devapriya. I don't know if she still wants to ask it, but if you want to ask it, you're welcome to go for it. Otherwise, if there's nothing to do, we'll move on. Okay. Trying to see my screen right now because the sun is just shining in my face. Okay, so we'll leave it at that then. So I want to thank from everyone, the three presented today, Graham, Rebecca, and Angelika. Very, very inspiring presentations. Very interesting. There's a lot of food for thought, especially for me. So I very much appreciate the way you went over that. I hope I didn't offend you in any way in the way I tried to kind of like chair this thing. So thank you for that. So tomorrow, and also I'd like to thank all the questioners as well. We had some very interesting questions as well. So I appreciate that as well. So tomorrow, same time, same place, we have three more presentations. We're going to continue on Angelika's line of thought. We're working with Ricardo, who's here. He's actually, anyway, he's going to be talking about the concept of God in the Bhagavad Gita and looking at it from a panentheistic account. We'll be also having Professor Edwin Bryant from Rutgers, and he'll be looking for a specific Vaishnava text, the Bhagavad Purana, which is widely revered. And he's looking interestingly into the lesser addressed attributes of God, that is beauty, and its connected attribute of form, and how that appears in the text. And we'll also be hearing from Professor Gavin Flood, who teaches who taught in the University of Oxford, teaches still, and for many years tolerated my own doctoral thesis. And he'll speak on reflections on Pancharatra conceptions of the deity, which should be really interesting. So I'm personally looking forward to this tomorrow. So again, thank you very much, everyone. If there's anything you want to add or wrap up, please feel free now. Otherwise, again, thank you and see you tomorrow, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Till later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Rebecca, we should talk one day because you have a lot of stuff that kind of overlaps on what I'm doing. So we got to.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Very nice talk. I mean, I'm looking forward to see your contribution, your book. I mean, you are dealing exactly with what we want. I mean, the structure of your presentation, which I suppose is the same structure of your paper, of your chapter. Yeah, I like it pretty much.
You're on mute.
Your mic is off. I don't know if she's hearing you.
It was me.
It's the standard mute thing.
I was like nervous. I wasn't like doing the thing that you had envisioned, so I'm glad to hear it aligns with what you were thinking.
It was not good. We wanted something that was kind of dealing with the issue at hand, you know, especially from a thought tradition that actually has been dealing with it for a lot longer than the Indian traditions have, you know. So it's always good to hear that. You know?
But one mistake that you did, Alan, I think we should have had Grant on one day and Rebecca on a different day. So we would have.
That's not me. That's you got to blame someone.
So like the philosophy would be there 2 days.
Oh, it was probably my fault. I have another commitment tomorrow and the day after, so my availability was not as good.
You could have asked Grant. I mean, I didn't think of that. I mean, it was my fault. Alan is right. It was my fault.
No, it's not what's fault. I think actually it worked anyway this way because I loved it. I noticed it's all listed in order. You have kind of, Benedict would have been here as well on this day if he didn't have the issue with the COVID thing. But
have like the philosophy talks before the Indian talk.
Yeah, I think that's important because otherwise it just goes into an internal debate about Indian thought, which is, doesn't really deal with the global aspect that we're trying to deal with, So I think it's good.
I'm very happy. Thank you very much, Rebecca. So here is also Francisco de Assis and Gabriel. They are the 2 other guys who make our team. And Benedict is not here. He's sick.
I don't see Gabriel. Oh, Gabriel's got his camera off. That's all. There he is.
It's really nice meeting you all. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we say bye-bye now.
Yeah, I guess so. Long. Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Take care. Until later.